Hello, and welcome to Economic and Political Weekly's podcast show, Research Radio. I'm your host Abhishek, and every Monday we will talk to scholars about their research methodology and process, what they didn't include in their research, how research can further equity, and much more. Professor Virginus Xaxa, who teaches at the Institute for Human Development in Delhi, joins us. His past research has focused on plantation labourers, tribal communities, agrarian structure, and social exclusion. Today he'll be speaking about tea plantations and the manner in which workers organize themselves to struggle for living wages and humane working conditions. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Xaxa. Would you like to start by telling us about what made you interested in learning and researching about tea plantations?
I grew up in tea estates, and my parents were working as plantation workers. So I had already some understanding of what actually been happening in the tea estates. When I began my doctoral program and started thinking of what is it that I should really work on those days, agrarian studies was very important, land questions. There were a lot of debates on the emergence of capitalistic agriculture in India.
Right, and can you tell us about how the tea plantation system emerged? Who benefited from the system and at whose expense?
In order to understand the emergence of tea states in India, I think one has to go back to history. In 17th, 18th century, find that the tea plantations, plantations in different part of the world are actually becoming a very important economy, like the coffee, the banana, sugarcane, and so on, so cotton and all that. Commercial crops which were needed in Europe. It were around these times that you find also the consumption of tea was quite common, let's say, among the royalties in the European, particularly in Britain. And they had a tea trade with China, and from China they used to get tea, and therefore the tea had become an important item of consumption in Britain. But then you find that sometime around the 19th century, beginning of the 19th century, you find that the relationship between Great Britain and China got strange. And that seriously impacted the export of tea from China to Great Britain. And therefore, they were frantically looking for an alternative place, because this has become a very important item of consumption, not only in Great Britain, but also in Europe. So it has a big market. It is within this context that they started experimenting the cultivation of tea in Assam and parts of Bengal, particularly Darjeeling and all. And this experimentation became successful. The first lot of the tea out of this experimentations from Assam around 1840s was sent for auction in Great Britain, and it fetched a very good price. So within a few years, you find that large number of investment came up, and a lot of tea grants were made available by the colonial state, and they were giving them a very concessional price. For example, supposing they give, let's say, 2,000 hectares of land, then they say, well, 10% of the land you have to bring into cultivation in the next 10 years. So this is the way in which it grew, and large number of tea companies really came up. And then, of course, the benefit of tea plantation was surely to the Great Britain, because I just told you that the capital was available. Land was also plenty and available at that time, because Assam, what is called, these are forest areas, and there was a very small, thin population. And therefore, it was, although you find that the tribals there made use of it, but there was a vast tract of jungles and wastelands. So it were these, therefore, that were under the control of the colonial state, and therefore they made land freely available to the what is called the capital, the British planters. So the land was in plenty. Capital was also available, because a lot of profit was already being made in Great Britain, and also by traders and the officials of British officials, let's say, in India. So they all needed a venue to plow them back. But only problem that they had was the shortage of labor, because the northeastern region, particularly Bengal or even Darjeeling or Assam, were very scanty populations, and they could not have really managed it to the. So even if all would have worked, even then it was insufficient, and people were not interested in working, because this was deep in the interior, infested with jungles, wild animals, and malaria and all that. And also you find that they had already doing their subsistence agriculture, so they were not interested in. So it is at this kind of in a context that they thought of having an organized recruitment. So organized recruitment therefore bring laborers from outside. So invariably you find, since local labor was not sufficient and local labor was also not forthcoming, because you find that the wages in the subsistence agriculture was higher than the kind of wages which were being paid in the tea estates. So they had to, therefore, because of this consideration, they had to look for a very steady and large supply of labor force. And therefore, you find that they started an organized system of recruitment. So Indian Tea Association primarily came up in order to see that as to how best they can do this organized recruitment of the labor. And therefore, they started sending the contractors here and there, and contractors will hire subcontractors and they will go to the interiors. They give them all kinds of false promises of high wages, of honey and milk, and so on and so forth, intimidations, kidnapping, all the kind of stories that we hear about the slave labor. In fact, the processes which have also happened in case of recruitment of labor, let's say in the tea states of Assam, Bengal, the laborers who were being recruited from different parts of India, particularly, let's say, in the initial phase, they did it from eastern UP and Bihar, because these were the areas from which labor was being recruited for Mauritius, for West Indies, and so on and so forth. But subsequently, you find that they shifted the site of the recruitment from the what's called the northern Bihar and eastern UP and parts of Bengal to tribal areas, which today are known as Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh or parts of Andhra Pradesh, because these were the areas where you find these were jungles and people were used to jungles. And also you find that these were the areas who were resisting the British rules and administrations. So there were large number of revolts and rebellions, from the 1800s to almost 1900. So almost this 100 years, there was a lot of tribal revolt and rebellion. So tea garden, in fact, became also one of the ways in which as to how to pump out their labor the tribals who were actually creating a law and order problem. They also could provide a very cheap labor, because you're far away from their place, which is almost, let's say, 1,500 kilometers or 1,600 kilometers. And on those days, once they go, it's very, very difficult to come back.
You already started talking about this, but I was interested in knowing more about the system of recruitment and how the capitalist class transitioned over time.
But because of the demand, there was always shortage of labor. What you really find that because of this, there was all kinds of speculations among the planters or the capitalists to make investment, etc. So, there were crises in tea industry as well. Even during those days, at certain phases, there were crises. During the 1929, that Great Depression we talk about in history. So that really brought a halt to the expansions of the tea estate. And also land, west land, another land which was available had also fallen short of, because of already land was reclaimed or given as a grant to the planters. So at that particular point of time, you find that the land which was being used by the cultivators, particularly what we call the zamindars or jodhas or rich landlords, in fact, they were also converting the subsistence agriculture into the tea plantation. So you also find that the entry of the natives into the tea industry, the Bengalis, the Assamese, the Marwadis were there. They were also entering into it. So that began around 1870s, 80s onwards, very soon after the introductions of the tea states by the British. But then, as I said, 1920, 1929, and then 30s, I think they were really a problem, because they had to come to an agreement, no more expansion. And then you find that the freedom struggle movement and all that, you don't know much about the tea states during those time between 1930, let's say 1920s, 1940s. There's not much of an expansion. It was more of a consolidation. And also you find that there were freedom struggle movements. So you find in many tea states, tea garden laborers who also participated in non-cooperation movement, etc., etc. So particularly those states which were closer to the towns. So then you find after the eve of independence, of course, the unions have already started to form, because railways, where this railway union was formed, and the people who were working in the railway union also gradually began to move into the tea states, where they were restricted, they were not allowed. but somehow they entered and started mobilizing it. So as early as the 1930s, 1930s, 1938, 1939, 1940s, you find a number of tea gardens, particularly in Assam and also partly in Bengal. The workers were organized by the unions, and there were some strikes and other kinds of movements.
And what is the role that globalization has played more recently?
If you look at the people who were recruited as the workers, they were already anyway experiencing globalization because they were producing for export. In the recent times, which has where you find globalization has become much more what is called evident, you find that its impact in the tea states has been very negative because it opened up, let's say, a little bit in the competition. Many tea gardens got closed because they were not able to compete with the markets or tea companies or what is called other countries which are producing tea. And therefore, immediately after opening up 1991, you find that around 2000, 1998, 1996, 2001, 2002, large number of tea gardens, particularly in Bengal and Darjeeling and also in Kerala, they were really closed down. And the managers ran away from the tea state and left the tea, what's called tea workers at the tea gardens without any kind of support. And that led to a lot of starvation. There's malnutrition, the human rights violations, etc., etc. Meanwhile, also to understand that as India became independent, most of the British were actually selling off their share or transferring their tea estates to the Indians. And therefore, by 1960s, 1970s, you find that although there were still some hold of the British companies or the foreign companies, you find that more or less you find large chunk of the tea estates or tea companies have almost become Indianized. You still find that there have been foreign companies which still have a stake in the tea industry.
Right, so tea workers have been experiencing the impact of globalization since the emergence of the plantation system. Focusing in on your research, we have this notes from the field segment where we'd like to learn about a few details from your fieldwork.
When I began doing good research in the tea estates, I think, I thought that it would be the smoothest, but I had really the most difficult time doing field work. Let's say in the 60s and 70s, you find that there were formation of unions, particularly in Bengal, you find that unions are multiple unions. So unions which are affiliated to Congress, unions which are affiliated to CPM, CPI, then you have RSP, and all that. And you find that in the 60s and 70s, particularly 70s, you find that the rivalry of the union. So what really happened that when I began to start doing my field work, already there was conflict between two rival unions in the tea state where I was doing a field work. And I had no idea that this thing happened, that because of the rivalry of the union, you find that there was a violence. And so when I began doing a field work, I was suspected as being a government servant, and trying to investigate the kind of violence and the murder that I actually taken place. So I had a hard time, getting into the field, but it took time. So almost for a month, I couldn't really do much. And then gradually started talking to them, establishing rapport. Then I started telling about them, my own life in the tea garden. So that is how I gained the confidence. Sometimes you want to do field work, etc., but then you also find that once you are doing it, you was working with laborers. Laborers also become very vulnerable because you find the management may approach them and say as to what exactly is the person who has come from an outside is really asking them.
And in your article, you've also discussed an important law on plantation worker and employer relations, the Plantation Labour Act, that was passed in 1951, quite close to independence. Can you tell me about the history of this law and how it was implemented?
In principle, Plantation Labour Act was very important. See, prior to independence, that is during colonial period, there was no act in terms of which the relationship between the planters and the workers can be regulated. So it was whimsical. Plantation Labour Act, which came up in 1951, was the first act which began to regulate the relationship between the management and the workers. So they have to get an appointment letter. The appointment letter must spell out as to what is the terms and conditions of work, etc. So that was Labour Act also had made a provision for education, for health. And when you talk about health, it was hospitals, doctors, nurses, medicines, sanitations, toilet facilities, etc. Then what is called, there were also recreation facilities. One of the important provisions also is to provide house. The housing, as you know, in the tea state was already being given, but these were kacha houses. So Plantation Labour Act made a stipulation that the houses have to be converted into pakka houses and the workers must get a pakka houses. This was a part of the rules. Many of the tea states started converting the kacha houses to the plantation, what is called the pakka houses. Since the law stipulates, though, you find that the pakka houses has been given to the workers, but they not all the families that have got it. Then you had the hospitals, so they are supposed to provide hospitals. This many number of workers, this many beds have to be in the hospitals. This many dispensaries has to be there. This many doctors have to be there, etc., etc. So that all this stipulated. Similarly, sanitations and other things. 60s, you do see there is a visibility of the fact that the pakka houses are being given, hospitals are there, dispensaries are there, doctors are there. So, but suddenly around 70s, you find that there has been a deterioration of this kind of services which were being given by the tea states. And if you look at the schools, you find that earlier they used to give a school, and a school is only primary school. So once you have a primary school, if you want to go to higher school, there's no space, there's no schools around nearby. So you have to go very far away and be in the boarding house, or somewhere else with the relatives and go to the town. The whole these kind of social welfare measures which is provided in the Plantation Labour Act, the outcome of this provision seems to be almost negligible. And today, if you really go to that, you find that I go often. So when we were children, we find that the hospitals were really very good. There were a large number of doctors were there. There were nurses were there. But today, if you really go the same tea state where I spent my life, if you go to the hospitals, you find that there very bad conditions. Doctors are just very few. Earlier, you find 5, 6 doctors used to be there. There are only 1 or 2 doctors. In many of these states, they don't even keep doctors. Someone from the town will come twice a day. So similarly, if you find the housing, you find that all the pakka houses that came up, it came in 60s and 70s and 80s onwards, you find there's no houses really coming up. So because of this, from 1980s, what really happened is gradually government began to take the responsibility of providing primary education. Many states, like West Bengal, in fact, took up the responsibility of providing the primary education to children from the state funds. So, a state began to employ teachers. Only responsibility of the tea state management was to provide school buildings. Gradually, you find that in many states, like even in Bengal as well as in Assam, some of the medical facilities which were supposed to be provided by the tea state is now being given by the government. Tea state management is almost shrinking its responsibility, abdicating itself from its responsibility of providing all those provisions which are supposed to be given under the Plantation Labour Act. Now, what do you find that since these are not being provided, the state government should have enforced it through what's called labor commissioners and others. But labor commissioners themselves, they don't come. In the 60s, they used to come, inspectors used to come and inspect whether the sanitations, the toilets, water and all that. Now they don't come. So what do you find that even the state is taking its responsibility from taking care of the welfare measures of the plantation. Only thing they think the government, the state, has that it passed a law, and it expects that since they have passed a law, they have done their responsibility towards the plantation labor. So in the process, you don't treat them as a citizen, in fact.
And why was it that tea estates were made responsible to provide social services that the government usually provided to other citizens?
Historically, if you really look at, all these things actually was being taken care of by the tea estate management. So the structure or the system was already in place during colonial period. Now the post-independent India did not imagine in a new way. They continued with that colonial system, the colonial structure, by just enacting a law, just formalizing what was earlier informal. So this is the only thing they do. And therefore, I think the reason as to why they did it, because the tea state management is very peculiar, because this is rural area. So it is not like a township where you have, most of the industries and they get industrialized. Here you find they are in the interior, and sometimes you find that they are even a more distant place than the villages. So you have absolutely no connections, what's called no communications, and so on and so forth. The post-independent Indian states should have been more imaginative in terms of addressing it. Or even when they saw that conditions of workers, both in terms of education and health, has not improved, Because if you really go, you find that in Assam and Bengal, it is among the workers that you find highest rate of illiteracy, and you find highest rates of malnutrition and so on and so forth. So when they realize that this is not really working, then I thought that the state in India, in post-independent India, should have been taken a more proactive concern, a more proactive role in terms of addressing these issues. But then that did not really happen. Now, what really happened is that tea estate management always keep on blaming that, the tea industry is running a loss. We are not able to pay our expenses. Are that we are providing houses, we are providing medicines, we are providing hospitals, we are providing rations and so on and so forth. So we pay in kind and we pay in cash. And therefore, you find that they will try to say but the minimum wage is very low in tea states. For example, even in Bengal, the wage which the plantation laborers get is lower than the minimum wage of the state. So you find that I think in Bengal it is around 169 or 70. In Assam, it might be just a little less than that, 165, something like that. I don't exactly remember now. So the wage of 160 or 70 a day is a lower than the minimum wage which has been stipulated by the states in Bengal as well as in Assam. Workers are making a demand for the minimum wage. And now they are saying it's not even minimum. So even if you give a minimum wage, then now they're making a demand for decent wage. But the planters are reluctant to it because they will say that we are giving you this, and therefore they say that we are giving more than the higher wages or more than the decent wage. So they will inflate their wage in terms of calculating the houses, the rations, the other kinds of facilities they give, and they say that we are already paying you around 350 or so and so, whereas the workers will say that no, you are paying only 170. So this dispute between the workers and the unions of the workers and the planters is really going on for almost since the post-independent era. You just don't know how to negotiate with, because even when planters are saying that we are doing, there's no transparency. There is no participation of the workers. Arbitrarily, they will fix up and say we are giving this, but that, as per the law, they were supposed to give. Now, I'm coming to the wage, and the questions once you had asked me is also about the minimum wage. Now, what really happened in the case of tea industry is in 1957 when the industrial wage board was worked out. See, the planters started arguing that we give employment to the family. The what is called industrial wage board has argued that 3 units of consumption must be the basis on which the wage should be determined. So that is 2 adults and 2 children. So that was 3 units of consumption. Now, everywhere you find that the industrial wage board, in fact, fixed the minimum wage based on 3 units of consumption. In case of tea industry, what you really see is that when this principle was introduced, the planters, both Indians and the British, they started arguing that in tea states, we give employment to the family, and that tea industry is passing through the crisis, and we cannot really give that kind of wage based on 3 units of consumption. Now, because of this kind of pressure tactics by the association of the planters, both Indian and the foreigners, the trade unions which were negotiating it, they agreed to what is called the 1.5 units of consumption. Now, that was a historical blunder which they made. How could they, in fact, agree to the fact that a wage should be determined on the basis of 1.5 units of consumption? Because they say the husband is working, wife is working, and they put 2 kids. So you have to give 1.5 units. Everywhere you did not have. In the 50s, you had people who may be working, husband, wife, and children. Even child labor was there in tea plantation. So they were working. But now you find that there is a huge surplus labor in the tea state. And the mini family, you find that there's only one person is really working. So the system which was in the 50s, when you find that everyone had a sort of full employment, in the sense that employment was there in the family, husband, wife, children used to work. That kind of system doesn't exist at all. So from the 70s onward, you find that there is a surplus, what is called the labor in the tea state. And as a result of which you'll find households which are just dependent on one person. And therefore, based on that kind of principle, because 1.5 units consumption, that has continued. And union has never challenged that. That it was something which was done in the 1950s, and probably at that particular point of time, that kind of, there was a number of workers. But even that is unethical, because anywhere when husband and wife works, you can't say that your wife is working, your husband is working, and therefore will give you half wages. That never happens anywhere. all throughout, you find the unions have always been asking for incremental increase in the wages. So you had, let's say, 1 rupee, so 1 rupee to 1 rupee 50 paisa to this paisa, that paisa. So what you will find that the blunder, the actual injustice which was done, to never address. And unions throughout this post-independent era, they have continued to negotiate an incremental wages over what the wages was there, let's say, previously. So as a result of which, you find that even today the wages are really very, very low. So the wage that we are talking about is based on the principle of 1.5 units of consumption, which cannot really sustain the workforce today.
Despite high levels of unionization and the participation of women, Dalits, and Adivasis, why is it that workplace abuse and exploitation remain commonplace on plantations?
The management was British, the foreigners, clerical staff was mostly Bengalis or the Assamese, and you find the workers were mostly tribal, so Dalits and, let's say, maybe some small OBCs. So you do find that today that the tea garden labor force in Assam, in Bengal, and also in South India, you find predominantly they come from the Dalit and Adivasi background. Vulnerability is also has come up because, as I told you, that earlier there was employment available because there was a demand for labor. But that demand for labor no longer exists today because there's a surplus labor. So what you will find out now that the children who are born out of the erstwhile plantation workers, they have no job. And many of them, therefore, are now start moving out for work, either in South India or other places, either in the towns and cities. Women are going as a domestic workers. So you find that the situations in the tea gardens have really become terrible now because there is no additional employment. And you find that because there has been no education, they have no other skills. They are not educated well. As I told you, level of literacy is very low, only primary schools. So only people who are getting private school, they are now going to high school, etc. And also you find that as far the plantation workers is concerned in Assam, they are not considered as the scheduled tribes or scheduled castes, the plantation workers. They can't even get a reservation facilities, even if they are educated. So they have to compete. They are mostly known as the more other backward classes. So whereas you find that their counterparts elsewhere are scheduled castes or scheduled tribes, in Assam, those who came, let's say, as a plantation workers, they are not treated as the scheduled tribes or scheduled castes. They are primarily treated as the more other backward classes. And therefore, the kind of constitutional obligations that one could have for the SCs and STs does not exist. Of course, there's a demand by the plantation labor force. In fact, this demand has been going on since 1950s, on which they are very sentimental about it. Every time they have organizations and movements, this assertions has been there for scheduled tribe status. So scheduled tribe status is one of them.
That's important, yes. And you've discussed how when tea estates moved from British to Indian hands at the leadership levels, Indians were more likely to erode on legal provisions for workers' rights and welfare. Why was this?
Whereas you see that there were improvements in the 60s and 70s, particularly 50s and 60s, till when the British were there. But after 1970s, particularly 1970s onward, you find there's been no improvement. Now, the treatment which the Indian planters or managers, in fact, they treat the tea garden workers exactly in the same way. Probably you find the British were a little more sympathetic to the plantation workers than the Indians. This is how I really feel about it. Because you find that there is an ethnicity or the caste biases, very strong ethnicity and caste biases. In case of the British, it could be racial, there's no doubt, but racial can be for anyone. But then at least they had something, let's say, for the workers, etc. In a sense, if there were laws, at least they tried to implement these laws. At least that is what you find in the 50s and 60s. They were trying to bring more houses under Pakka houses, better what is called health facilities, doctors were there. This all I have seen as a child, as I grew up. But that has completely disappeared after 1960s, mid 1960s and 70s. So things are worse today. And you find that I think the caste of mind is very strong among us. And therefore, you find that the Indians who are on the top of the management or who are actually running the company or run the company, they don't treat workers who come from the let's say Adivasi or the Dalit background in a dignified manner. They could have done away with many of the systems which is a colonial legacy, but they want to perpetuate the colonial legacy. They won't allow, let's say, outsiders, activists, human rights activists, or others to come into the tea state. Now, these were the kind of system which was there during colonial period. As Indians, they could have done away with it. They don't. They want to continue having that. So, you as a journalist, journalist or an activist, you cannot enter into the tea estate.
And can you tell me more about this wedge between union leaders and workers?
Most of the trade union leaders or those who were part of the unions, they happen to be the Bengali or they happen to be the Assamese. And the workers happen to be the Dalits and Adivasis or the others. And then you also find that the managers again happen to be the Bengalis or the Assamese. So what you find that trade union leaders somehow got a kind of ethnic, what is called connections with the management. And that connections between the tea union leadership and the management by virtue of the fact they belong to the same ethnicity, somehow compromise the what is called the articulations and the assertions of the trade union in terms of addressing the interests of the workers. Secondly, you find that even unions, they just confined to the wage and bonus. They never address the problems of the education. They never try to address the problems of the health facilities that are deteriorating. They never try to address the problem of the culture. So they had what is called control over the workers, but then that remained as is just confined to wage bonus and something connected with again monetary benefits. And at best, you find that they became also a vote banks for the respective political parties. If you really go and workers and if you really ask them, then you say, well, our unions are compromising. Our unions have what is called collaborating with the management, and they belong to the same. They will say they belong to the same job. They belong to the same group, and therefore they come together, and in the process they compromise our workers' interests. So this is the kind of feeling that there among the workers, and therefore you find that today many of these issues of the labor, rather than being taken by the union, actually it is more rigorously or more vigorously is being taken by the organizations which belongs to the plantation workers. Like you have Tea Tribe Students Association, or there are NGOs which have been formed by the Adivasis or plantation workers. So what do you find in Assam, for example, Student Association, all Adivasi Students Association of Assam or Tea Tribe Students Association? They are much more powerful than all Assam Samadu Sangha, which is which has almost monopoly of unionship in the among the tea garden workers. So similarly in Bengal, you find there has been a problem now, and the unions which are being run by the CPM or by the RSP, etc., etc. In fact, are being taken over by unions. There's a progressive tea workers union which have been formed by the Akhil Bharatiya Adivasi Parishad. So in Darjeeling, you find that union has already become a Gorkha Union. I don't exactly remember the name now. It's Gorkha League or Gorkha League Union. So you find that the union itself is becoming more ethnicized, which I don't think it's good. But because of the failure of our kind of unions, you find that people have taken up the responsibility to addressing the issues on the ethnic lines. That's I think is very unfortunate.
And why is that? Have unions based on ethnicity not been effective as well?
If unionization becomes along the lines of the ethnicity, then ethnic confrontation may really come up, which has never happened. So tea garden, one good thing about tea garden workers is such a multi-ethnic society, multi-caste society, but because they all come from a lower social kind of background, there has never been conflict. They have all been together. Although sometimes you find that there might be a sporadic. But if this kind of organizations really come up, which is primarily trying to look at rather than in terms of workers, in terms of trying to do Adivasi or Nepali, in the long run, probably you will find that it will be ethnic problems will come up. But at least till today, you find that workers in any tea state has really come as a workers because that is their life support system, so they have not so far ethnicized themselves, but they look at the outsiders primarily in terms of ethnicization and it's precisely because of they belong to higher caste, to different ethnic background, and that's the reason they don't really address their problems as effectively and as they should have been. That is the kind of feeling that is there.
Right, and in the article, you've made several suggestions about how to overcome colonial practices and enable workers with rights. Can you share some of these?
So, because these large tea estates, you find that there has been a settlement of the workers within the tea estate. That is where they also give the houses. So, you have different settlements. Now, what is really happening that since the land belongs to the state, the workers who have been living in that what is called house or that quarter for ages, their parents or the children, etc., they don't have any rights. So what really happens when they retire, they can always be, so if their children are already working, then they can stay with the children. But if the children are not really working, they are shelterless. because they have to leave the tea gardens and they don't have any other property. So what I was reading, so wherever they have an houses in the tea states, now they have been here for almost what nearly 200 years. So the people who have been retiring and who at least in the settlement or the habitat which they have, they must have a tenurial right. They are not really evicted from the tea estate as and when, because they may say that you are no longer a worker in the tea estate, so you have to leave. Within the tea estate, in fact, state must construct the schools, taking into consideration maybe 5 or 6 states together. You can have at least one high school, you can have one good hospitals, etc., because the hospitals which are being run by the management is very savvy safe. So this is the way in which you can actually curtail the complete monopoly over the land which the tea estate has been enjoying. After all, even these are on the lease. The tea estate management have got this lease for many years. So it is not a completely permanently ownership they have. It's a lease. So if one really have a more imaginative mind and the state really takes the plantation workers as its citizens, not in the formal sense as a legal citizens, but also in giving them all kinds of benefits which it gives to the citizens elsewhere, then they need to enter into the tea estate and address these problems. One can completely break the monopoly that the tea estate management has over the workers. In other words, the control stretches from morning almost 24 hours a day. That kind of a control needs to be broken, and that is possible only when the state really comes. And when a state comes, then it's a possibility for the civil society also to enter into it, at least where there is a control of the state.
Are there unanswered questions that you continue to investigate?
Adivasis are now gradually moving beyond just being a plantation workers to, let's say, a kind of workers belonging to certain ethnic groups, and they are now ready to organize themselves also along the larger ethnic lines, and therefore move also the domain of culture and politics. So that's, I think, so rather than just confined to the economic sphere, now they're moving to the sphere of culture and politics, and that, I think, is an interesting issue, and I would really like to explore that particular way in which it is really moving.
That was a lot of rich and detailed information. Thank you so much for sharing it with us, Professor Xaxa. Something that he said early on in the podcast really stayed with me. The fact that Adivasis had rebelled against the British, were forcefully evicted and moved to estates. This met the British goal of controlling land and investing in growing their capital via tea estates and maintaining low costs. Savarna Indians continued similarly exploitative practices through the violation of labor laws, and the state remained pliant. I do recommend reading the entire article, and I've shared a link to it in the description of this podcast. Next week, we'll speak to Dr. Afia Sherbano Zia about Pakistan's Aurat March that takes place every year to mark Women's Day. Dr. Zia passes through the backlash the march received by tracing the history of the government's treatment of women and the fraught relationship between religion and patriarchy. The podcast is sure to be interesting, and to make sure you don't miss out on it, subscribe to us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, or Overcast. This is the 6th episode of Research Radio, and we would love to hear from you about how we're doing. Send us an email at social@epw.in or ping us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter with your feedback. For those who've already sent us feedback, thank you so much. And if you like what we're doing, please share it with interested folks. Take care and do tune in next week.